What's wrong with Russians? How did they allow a tyrant to come to power? Didn't they try to resist him? I've made this video to tell you about the history of Russia in the 21st century and answer these questions. My name is Nikolai Martynenko, I have lived in Russia all my life, I am against Putin's regime, I wish freedom for Russia and of course I support Ukraine in this war. Let's start now.
Who is Mr. Putin?
Russia is completely free. Time has come to change this.
Before I start, I'll warn you right away. In this video, I will simplify a bit so as not to turn this into a history textbook. If you find inaccuracies in my story, please point them out in the comments to this video. To begin in the beginning, Putin came to power in 1999, 23 years ago. At that time, Russia was still undergoing dramatic and painful transformation from the Soviet system to democracy, from planned economy to the free market. Russian society was trying to recover from extreme poverty and the local civil war in Chechnya Republic. Salaries often went unpaid for months, and the crime rate had been extremely high for almost 10 years. Yet another blow came with the 1998 economic crisis. The democratic government of Boris Yeltsin was losing popularity, while a lot of money and power concentrated in the hands of several magnates. They were the new owners of the biggest companies in the country, those that used to belong to the Soviet government. Needless to say, this acquisition process had been non-transparent and very likely corrupt. By the end of the 90s, people in Russia were tired of economic injustice. Many were nostalgic for the economic equality and stability of the Soviet era, while others feared the return of the USSR. Confidence in electoral institutions was undermined as parliamentary seats were sometimes simply sold. Boris Yeltsin, unpopular and unhealthy, decided to resign and appointed a young prime minister as acting president. A former KGB agent who gave security guarantees to the outgoing head of state and promised not to conduct corruption investigations against his family. So, Putin initially came to power not even as a result of elections, but because the previous president appointed him before resigning. Putin was a grey and inconspicuous official, a compromise between opposing clans, and would hardly have been elected even for a second term if it weren't for three things that changed the course of Russian history. First, the transformational period was over. The economic reforms of the 90s started to have their effect. This had started already in 1999, before Putin came to power, but people began to notice it already after Putin had become president. Second, oil prices began their staggering growth, providing vast sums of money to the Russian budget. This was not thanks to Putin either, but people naturally linked rising salaries to his face on TV. And third, at the turn of the century, there were several terrorist attacks in Russia. Explosions of residential buildings, hostage-taking in schools and theaters. People wanted protection, like in the US after 9/11, and there was high demand for a strong leader who can deal with the terrorists. Putin's KGB background and confident rhetoric promising an uncompromising stance against terrorism reassured the public. All this resulted in Putin quickly becoming extremely popular. But at that time you could already see the first signals of a future dictatorship. The fact is that Putin did not allow public criticism of himself at all. Even during his first presidential term, he sent the most successful oil magnate, Khodorkovsky, to prison for 10 years. The reason for that was actually that Khodorkovsky at a meeting with Putin publicly reminded him of flourishing corruption in the country. Moreover, in 2006, the journalist Politkovskaya and the former FSB agent Litvinenko were assassinated. Politkovskaya sharply criticized Putin and the actions of the Russian army in Chechen war. She published hundreds of materials about the fate of civilians and soldiers broken by the war, held the mothers of killed soldiers in court, and conducted investigations about corruption in the Ministry of Defense. Politkovskaya was shot in the elevator of her own house in the center of Moscow with 4 shots at point-blank range. In 1998, Litvinenko publicly stated that his superiors had ordered him and his colleagues to kill the influential businessman and politician Boris Berezovsky. After that, he was fired from the FSB and several criminal cases were fabricated against him in Russia. He also criticized the Russian authorities and President Vladimir Putin. Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium-210, a rare and difficult to detect radioactive substance. Why didn't it cause public outrage? Remember what I told you just a minute ago? Those cases were easy to hide behind the high crime rate and non-transparent acquisition of a big oil company. How to prove that imprisonment of Khodorkovsky and assassinations of Politkovskaya and Litvinenko are connected precisely with the criticism of Putin and not with their other non-political activities? But most importantly, Putin gained control of the media and especially television. Two most popular TV channels, NTV and Channel 1, both criticized Putin in connection with the sinking of the Kursk submarine. As a result of the raid takeover of NTV and political pressure on Channel 1, both channels became subject to the Kremlin. Television remained the most popular medium for many Russians, and soon propaganda would flow through it, justifying everything the government does, including the current war in Ukraine. But back then, these seemed to be negligible hiccups. At the same time, Russian society experienced booming income growth. For the first time in its history, people in Russia enjoyed consumerism, buying imported refrigerators and TVs, new cars and apartments. Only 15 years between this photo and this. Forgive me for spending so much time on the exposition, but these details are necessary to understand exactly how this silent agreement between society and the authorities was formed. You don't get into politics, in return, we give you the opportunity to earn money and enjoy living for your own pleasure. Did Russians see their own country as democracy? The answer would be mostly yes. New social, economical and political freedoms made a huge contrast with the preceding Soviet time. Why mostly and not fully? The system granted the president way more power than democratic leaders normally have. This was hardly a problem when the society and the government were happy with each other and the current state of affairs. Skyrocketing oil prices of the early 2000s were making this agreement possible for years. Being able to afford new apartments, cars, fridges and jewelry, people in Russia turned their gaze away from the government and politics in general. Meanwhile, democratic achievements of the 90s were reverted and the president consolidated even more power. Public opinion started to change in 2011 during the parliamentary elections. The world economic crisis made the corruption in the ruling classes even more obvious, decreasing the popularity of the ruling party. Afraid to lose power, the government used blunt fraud to retain votes. This fraud became so obvious that it sparked public outrage and the first major protest in a long time. In addition to that, people were also unhappy that Putin would again run for president in 2012. If elected, it would be his third term, despite the fact that, according to the Russian constitution, the president cannot be elected for more than 2 terms. Putin clung to the wording. It says no more than 2 terms in a row. Russians finally realized that the current president Medvedev was just a lane between Putin and the law. They even began to use a special term from chess for this – castling. This was the moment when it became obvious that this government doesn't welcome criticism. Instead of cancelling the voting results, the government took the path of repressions. People leading the post-election protests were arrested and persecuted. New repressing laws were being passed with increasing speed, gradually making the public activity more and more dangerous. An attempt to influence the authorities through the elections was also unsuccessful. In 2013, Alexei Navalny, who became one of the leaders of recent protests, ran for mayor in Moscow and came second with surprisingly many votes. Putin was frightened by the growing popularity of an independent politician, so a criminal case was fabricated against Navalny as well. Again, under pressure from protests, the politician was released from custody while his brother became a government hostage for several years. The government managed to stabilize the situation. However, it became clear that the silent agreement between the government and the people began to erode. So we are in the end of 2013. Putin is losing popularity. Protests become more popular despite the arrests. Evident corruption of the elites annoys more and more people. The newly formed middle class starts to be more interested in politics. Younger generation doesn't have memory of the Soviet time. They value freedom and they are not afraid of the government. Oil prices have stopped rising, unlike the appetite of the elites he fed during 13 years. At the same time, Ukraine is experiencing a revolution, Maidan. Wait. We were talking about Russia, Putin, corruption, dictatorship. Why suddenly Ukraine? How are these events related? It may not be obvious, but Ukrainian politics were always important for what was happening in Russia. These shots frightened the Russians, who did not understand the background and essence of the confrontation between society and power in neighboring country. Most Russians did not understand the difference between the political systems of Russia and Ukraine, because back in the Soviet Union they were very similar countries. And Russian propaganda fell precisely on this ground of misunderstanding. It lied to the Russians about Nazis, about the ban on the Russian language, about the atrocities of the Ukrainian army against the ethnically Russian population of the eastern regions of Ukraine. But most importantly, the revolution in Ukraine frightened Putin. Two pictures formed inside his head. The first is the opposition in Russia, which is gaining popularity despite the repressions. Their values are civil rights and freedoms, good relationship with the European Union and so on. They were very similar to Ukrainian students with whom the Maidan began. The second is the forced flight of the corrupt pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Yanukovych. Putin realized that they would do the same to him. At that time, this became Putin's main idea, to prevent Ukraine from leaving Russia's sphere of influence, to prevent it from joining the European Union and NATO, to prevent Ukrainians from living normally, and most importantly, to prevent Russians from a successful example of revolution in a closed country in socio-cultural, economic and linguistic terms. This was the real reason for the annexation of Crimea and the creation of quasi-states in eastern Ukraine. For the Russians, the almost bloodless annexation of Crimea looked like an absolute geopolitical victory of Putin. His rating has grown significantly. This extinguished protest moves in Russia for several years and reduced the popularity of opposition politicians. The sanctions were not too sensitive for the Russian economy. Almost no one cared about the EU concerns. Russia, in fact, was almost not punished for foreign policy aggression. Gas and oil continued to flow into the European Union, bringing in super profits to the Russian budget, and in the future this will also lead to the big war in Europe. But did nothing really happen after the annexation of Crimea? Where did the middle class interested in politics go? Is it true that the Russians have stopped fighting Putin's regime? All in all, the war with Ukraine began on February 24th. Where are the protests? This is a complex topic. If you are interested, please mention it in the comments below. If there are 50 comments, I will make a separate video about what was happening between 2014 and 2023. Well, now you know a bit more about preconditions of future dictatorship in Russia. But do you know how Putin's regime uses elections in order to masquerade its democracy? What else is used to fight independent opinion? And what is the real opinion of the Russians about Putin and war? Watch our another video here. If you would like to help spread the nuanced view on the Russian society, please share this with your friends. Click on the subscribe button and notification bell below. That's all, and thank you.